Welcome everybody to Go Local Monday Business. It's all happening here in downtown Providence. I'm Josh Fenton. This is Gary Sasse. Cha-ching. Good weekend, Mr. Sasse?
Very good.
Profitable?
Very
Stock
good.
market up, earnings up.
All-time high in this.
All-time high. Guys like you must just lather in money on the weekends after a week like that on the stock market.
Well, I don't know if lather's the right word.
Lather, baths full of cash.
Don't know about that.
Coinage,
Pennies and dimes and nickels, so we know.
bearer bonds, all those types of things that rich people have that the rest of us yearn for. Let's jump right into it. Providence schools, Rhode Island schools. Let's start in Providence. The governor made an announcement that she is, quote, studying the city of Providence's educational condition. I believe that we wrote about it first. Code words for a beginning of an effort for the state of Rhode Island to ultimately take over Providence schools. Your thoughts on that strategy?
Well, I don't know what takeover means. I think it's useful for the state to come in, excuse me, and work with the city, work with the administration and the school committee and the superintendent to find out what's going on in Providence. Excuse me.
Joe, can you grab a water?
Yeah, please. Sorry. To find out what's happening in the city of Providence. We know Providence has failing schools, but Providence is not the only city with failing schools.
No.
Central Falls.
That the state has already taken over
Yeah,
about 30 years ago?
I was involved in that. We did a really good job there. Let's start again.
No worries. Well, you take a cough break.
Yeah.
Gary.
Thanks.
I think what the intent is that Providence schools have tried multiple efforts to reform over the years, failed each time, never really implemented anything, and that the test scores functionally in many ways couldn't get any lower. You've got, we cite the numbers at Hope High School, proficiency in the high school in one grade is 7% for English, 1% for algebra, and 2% for geometry. I might be getting those backwards, but in other words, 90+% are not capable of doing basic coursework in core educational.
Okay, let's be honest with each other. Okay, we know Providence is failing schools. You just articulated that. We know that's been the case for a while. We know that Providence is not the only urban school system where student performance is low. So if it's just to go back in and document that, that's a simple waste of time.
Right.
If it's to go in and look at some basic issues and recommend get well plans, then that could be helpful to the city, the kids, most importantly the kids and their parents, and the state. So they need to look at the curriculum framework. And I don't have any idea whether the city is doing well or not in these areas. They have to look at whether there's high stakes testing. They have to look at whether teachers are being evaluated. In Massachusetts, one of the evaluations mechanisms was to tie test results to teacher performance. Are they willing to have that kind of conversation here? So it's one thing to say we're going to go in and look at the schools. They have to look at school site management, how they want to make sure that the principals have the authority. Do the principals even want the authority?
Right.
And so it's not a question of going in and looking at the schools. It's going in and working with the mayor and the superintendent on a get well plan. And a get well plan, there are boxes to check. One box is curriculum, another is school site management, a third is high stakes testing, and a fourth is evidence-based evaluation of teachers and having the flexibility of getting rid of bad teachers just as you get rid of a bad kid, put him in suspension. But the fifth thing they have to do, which no one wants to talk about, and the governor has been not supportive of this at all, is to come up with a constitutional protection to make education an enforceable right. And you can do all the things I just mentioned, and they're helpful, but if education is not a constitutional right, if the parents don't have recourse, if the schools are failing their kids, then you ain't done much. And the other issue that they have to address, which they have not been politically willing to address, is the question of funding. Now, Rhode Island, like most of the states, has a school aid formula. And the formula is probably a garden variety, okay school aid formula. I'm not critical of the school aid formula, but there's a couple of things that we do know. We know that to provide access to adequate educational opportunities, it costs more for a kid that doesn't speak English. It costs more for a kid that lives in poverty. It generally costs more for urban kids. So instead of all this hyperbole of we're going to go in there and work with the mayor and fix up the schools, put the money on the barrelhead. Talk about a constitutional amendment to guarantee a right to adequate educational opportunities. Talk about adequately funding programs that we know have savage inequalities in them, the way we fund kids that don't speak English, the way we provide opportunities for low-income kids. When you do that, then I'll believe you that you're really doing something worthwhile.
So when we look at the data across the country of school systems by state and their per pupil spending, Rhode Island is at the higher end. I believe it's 7th or 8th. Massachusetts is the other. So it's consistent with the spending per pupil of Massachusetts. How it gets doled out
That's
is different.
totally misleading figure. And I'll tell you why it's a totally misleading.
How, pray tell, is
Oh,
per pupil spending a
Because you have to look at where the money comes from.
Okay.
Okay, now, I haven't looked at this for a number of years, so I stand to be corrected. But when you...
Or said to be corrected.
Yes, well, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, which is frequently. But if the money is coming primarily from the property tax,
Yeah.
then you create all kinds of economic and social issues on that. If the money is coming from state aid, then you're equalizing opportunity. Well, Rhode Island ranks way down in the percentage of the dollars coming from state aid. So, and that's a big part of the equation. So we're 7th highest property tax. There was a study done by Wallet Hub that said we're the 4th highest property taxes. We know we can't increase property taxes much more in Providence. So if you want to talk about, it's not a question of what you spend per pupil. We spend a lot per pupil. It's a question of what the mix of that revenue is. It's a question of, if you want to rebuild your cities, schools are a major, major part of it, but also another part is affordability, it's competitive property taxes. So when the state is willing to increase its share of the big, high amount of money that we do spend, that will have a major impact on urban schools. And until that happens, I'm a skeptic.
So I'm not sure I understand why $17,000 versus $17,000. Now, if the state average is $17,000 per pupil, I can see why the demands of Providence might be higher,
Right.
and revenue might need to shift over. Listen, property taxes I don't think are going to go up in any substantial way in Providence. They're amongst the highest.
And they shouldn't, because they're a major factor in the city's non-competitive position in attracting commercial.
Especially in commercial real estate.
Yeah,
where it's 5th, 3rd, 4th, 5th, depending on the year.
When you look at the largest city in each state, where I think the last time I looked at those figures, we were 5th. The problem is this, as far as education spending in Providence is concerned. Probably spend more per pupil than most places, but to provide an adequate education for the things that I mentioned, I don't want to repeat myself, it is a question of investment, and we're not making the investment relative to what the needs are to provide adequate educational opportunities, and so that's an issue.
Let's give the benefit of the doubt to the governor. Let's say that the governor is saying in this initial articulation of an evaluation, I don't think this is just an evaluation. I think this is the first step in a move, to what we're hearing from members of her administration, in which the Providence would cede control of the system. And admittedly, Central Falls was no victory, but really control never got ceded in many ways. It's still superintendents appointed by the town, by
But
the
there's no
city.
school committee. The school committee is a state-appointed school committee in Central Falls, I believe.
I think the mayor does, and I think the superintendent is appointed by the school committee, and I think
No,
there's a lot
superintendent is,
of,
but the school committee itself, I think, is appointed by somebody outside the city, but I'm not sure about that.
I think it's local control. I think it's local control on almost all the major trigger items. Also, I just don't think there's an aspiration to fix the schools anywhere across the board in Central Falls. Providence is a little more dynamic. It is the capital city. Imagine what Providence would be like economically, vibrantly, growth, etc., if it had competitive school system.
Okay, well, no,
Be
getting
one of the best cities in the country.
getting a competitive school system is very important, but like I said before, it requires investment. And it's so while our spending is high, the needs are higher, and then it is important to know where it comes from. Since you can't increase property taxes very much to get the money for that investment,
Right.
it has to come from the state, and the state
Or
provides.
does it come from Barrington? I mean, realistically,
It does now
Does
come-
the formula get shifted again?
Well, it does come from Barrington, now,
But it
there-
would even more so.
Well, there are communities in this state that don't get 10% reimbursement from,
Right.
and that there's a question of how you balance, equity and accessibility. The issue in Providence is pretty clear. You need to make more investments so kids can get access to adequate programs, and and that money has to come from the state. That we agree with. Now, where it comes from the state and how it comes from the state, there are options. You can change the formula and take from Peter to pay Paul. I happen to live in a community, East Greenwich, which I think we get 7 or 8% reimbursement. When we first started talking about the formula, this is like 40 years ago.
Sure.
There was a minimum share ratio. And every town, because just to open the door, there were expenses, every town got a 25% reimbursement. Right. That was disequalizing. It's been all over the playground. It was 25%, then it was 15%, then it floated free. But it's not just a question of taking money from communities that are getting a single-digit reimbursement. It's a question of the state increasing its support for urban schools, and that then becomes a priority question, and that's what has to be addressed. So the other thing that I think is really interesting, and I find it a little bit oxymoronic, one of the things that will come out, I believe, of the education reform program that the legislature will be proposing soon is school site management.
Yeah.
And the concept is a good concept. It worked in Massachusetts. It's the idea that the government closest to the people governs best, Thomas Jefferson. And it's the idea that people in the community, the parents, the teachers in the school, know more about what their schools need and what's happening in their schools than some bureaucrat, sitting 20 miles away. So if that
And there's also more local accountability.
Okay, now
rather than some guy up at the State House.
So now we have state takeover of a district.
Yeah.
So I'm confused.
Yeah.
Unconfuse me, please.
I think that's the duality. I think Providence is considered such a lost cause. Listen, the test scores were horrible in 1991 when I was on the city council. They're horrible now. It's interesting that this process has begun. Not a word from a member of the Providence City Council, not a word from the school committee chair, not a few words from the head of the teachers union.
What did that person say?
Which person?
Teachers union. That's
I
where the
think willing to participate in a process.
Correct. Well, that's good, because if we're going to take over the Providence schools, or if we're going to work to improve the Providence schools, then there are tough political choices that have to be made, and everybody's interest will get gored. From the teacher's perspective, it is absolutely difficult to understand what a takeover would mean unless you had evidence-based evaluation of teachers.
Right.
That means, and put it in English, that you're responsible for the test scores of your kids to some degree. It means that we have high-stakes testing, that kids don't move up unless they meet certain standards and qualifications. Those are very tough political decisions to make, and places that make those decisions, they're a political course. Massachusetts made those decisions back in 1991 on teacher evaluation and high-stakes testing. So when this kumbaya is
Well,
finished.
and look at the repercussions of that, right? They made those tough choices. They've stuck with them. In February in the United States of America, the economy added 33,000 new jobs. 1/3 of those new jobs came from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
And that's the point. We know it has to be done. Do we have the political will to do it? Now, you can take the frosting off the cake and you can say, okay, we're going to have curriculum frameworks. That's good. And you're going to say we have more site-based school management because local people are closer and they understand the problems and probably could solve the problems better. We have a case study in Massachusetts where that worked. But you ain't getting there until you have accountability. And you ain't having accountability until you have evaluation of teachers and until you have high stakes testing, until you put the proper resources in. So I don't mean to be a skeptic, because I think what the mayor and the governor are planning to do is a good first step. But I also want people to be realists, and I want them to understand that it's not about what's easy to do, it's about what's hard to do. And what's hard to do are the things I mentioned: evaluation, high stakes testing, and funding. That's the tape. That's the battle of the tape. You win on those points and you'll win the match. If you don't do that, you won't win the match.
Does Governor Raimondo have to come up with a solution on education to have a lasting legacy as being governor of Rhode Island? She's now changed out commissioners. She's made a pretty bold initiative in stepping forward, saying that there's a significant state role in improving Providence's school system. Providence's school system has been horrific for decades. No mayors wanted to touch it. Cianci didn't want to deal with it. Paolino didn't want to deal with it. Cicilline didn't want to deal with it. Tavares didn't want to deal with it. And Alorza certainly hasn't wanted to deal with it. So,
well, Bruce Sullivan spoke about site-based schools. He had little budgets for
when
those
he
schools.
was the chair of the school committee.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
No.
He was a better. Let me put it this way: he was a more effective governor than he was chair of the school committee.
I don't think it's so much of an individual's legacy. I think it's really about the economic well-being of the people in the state. And if the economic well-being of the people improve, then that will define the legacy. And education, as we know, is key to it. The issue on education with the governor is very interesting. She has proposed, and has implemented a number of programs that obviously meet a need. So she's talked about pre-K, she's talked about free community college, so-called computers in every classroom.
Yeah.
I want to go to all the schools and see them.
Right.
And those are good things, but no one has talked about, she's talked about this too, that by the end of the third grade, kids can read, because that's a key indicator of future success. And so I think if the legacy is to be tied to the objective of improving quality of life here, then it has to get back to the basics. It's not announcing an expansion of a program or a new program. It's really staying with your knitting and making sure kids by the third grade could read, make sure that the system is accountable. In this whole conversation, I don't hear anybody talking about accountability. I hear people talking about curriculum frameworks, need them. I hear people talking about more local control, good idea. Thomas Jefferson thought it was a good idea, so it must be. But I haven't heard about evaluation for teachers based on their kids' performance. I haven't heard about renewing high-stakes testing, a little bit maybe. And so,
a little bit on high-stakes
yeah, I think that's
testing.
fair, yeah. So it's hard to speculate, but I think I know what the benchmarks need to be, what the boxes to check are, and we'll see if they check them. These are going to be some tough choices.
The chairman of the Providence School Committee is walking by right now. Should we rap on the glass and get him in here? And
He's pretty occupied on the phone.
Have him join the conversation. But it's interesting. We've seen a number of governors. Bruce Sunland's legacy was he built things, the airport, the convention center. Don Kachiri's legacy was he built things, Deepwater Wind, 38 studios, but he went in big, bold initiatives. Wouldn't it really be maybe the greatest achievement if Governor Raimondo was able to implement reforms that created a long-standing reform to Rhode Island's educational system?
Absolutely.
Not just in Providence, but across the state.
Well, I think I'll even be a little more conservative and say if there were long-term reforms that addressed our urban communities, our failing schools where most of the people live, that would be as important an accomplishment as anything else that you mentioned, of course. Yeah. Absolutely.
Kate Nagel broke a story last week on the legislative initiative to create the framework, spoke to Representative Greg Amore, who's the point person on the House side. He articulated functionally a framework very, very similar to the Massachusetts construct, and other sources have told us it is the Massachusetts construct in whole. Is that something they can get past this year?
I think they can pass a lot of it, yes, absolutely.
Do they need to do it as a holistic reform, or do you run the risk of saying, oh, we're going to do the easy part this year and the hard part next year, and then you're into an election
Well,
year?
no, I'd
The
start-
union's influence is more important next year, makes it harder.
I think this is the year to do the hard part, not the easy part, because the unions have done so well up there this year.
A little horse trading with the governor's office and veto.
With evergreen contracts, with the overtime for firefighters. So the unions have had a number of victories up there. So now if you need to do the hard part on teacher evaluation and high stakes testing, there'll never be a better time. I'm always suspicious of government. I'm suspicious of business too, that have 5-year programs. The communists had 5. Look what happened to Joseph Stalin. No,
Chairman Mao, I think he had a 5-year program.
Yeah, and
Right.
so you implement the first part, and the second part becomes more difficult. I think if education is as problematic as it is, and I think most people would agree that we have major challenges there, then just pass the legislation, implement what you can, and get on doing it.
Is it worth trading? You've been a horse trader up there over the years. Is it worth trading real teacher evaluation, high stake testing in exchange for something like evergreen contracts? Is that a good deal for Rhode Islanders?
I wouldn't make that deal because I think contracts have alphas and omegas, beginnings and end. And that's an interesting thing too, and I haven't gamed this or thought this out yet. How do you make change in a school if you have an evergreen contract and you want to change work rules?
Well, if it's an overriding state statute.
Well, there can be overriding state statutes, but that overriding state statute has to be implemented.
Right.
And we know there's work to rule. There's
Yep.
overriding state statutes, but somehow people still get paid and work to rule, and kids go to school. I don't know. It's education. If you lose sight of the value and the fact that education is a shared responsibility, and you say there's an overriding state statute, then good luck in implementing it.
Then what's the answer? If you say, okay, listen, unions are players up there. Some years they're the strongest, some years they're not. We've been at this for 2,000-3,000 years since the beginning of civilized world. Rhode Island has been tripping and humming and hawing about education reform. Now, due to the parallelism of the two testing standards in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, it is unequivocal that our schools are inferior to the schools who live across the state line.
As a matter of fact, if Rhode Island was a single school district, we'd be in the bottom 10% of Massachusetts districts. That kind of puts it in graphic light. You can't stop, and you got to try, but you got to be as comprehensive as you can. And I think the 5 or 6 points that I outlined all need to be addressed. There need to be curriculum frameworks. The education of teachers and the training of teachers needs to be tied to what they're going to teach. There needs to be more local control, more school site management, less state takeovers. But then you have to confront the issues of whether the meetings of the people that make the decision for the school are open and subject to ethics rules, and how you do budgets, the way budgets will change, and how you change Title 16, which deals with the roles and responsibilities of different groups. Those changes are hard. There has to be high stakes testing. I think we've started it, but testing has to mean something, and there has to be an accountability agenda. Those things, no one of those things or those things collectively guarantee success. People guarantee success, but you limit the chances of making any meaningful change to the degree you step back from any one of those 4 points. So legislation with those 4 points and just accountability, work hard. The governor's legacy, frankly, in education, will be if the legislature gives her a game-changing set of initiatives, that she work hard to see that they get implemented.
So I think there's a premise that the faculty at these schools are obstructionists. And
At the public schools?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't buy that.
No, I don't. I think they want to be, they're professionals. They want to do the best they can. And I think for many of them that I've spoken to, they're embarrassed at these test results. They don't want to be last, when you weight it for per pupil spending, you can make the argument that Rhode Island has the worst schools in the country based on what's invested and what the outcome is.
See, what-
Is this an opportunity to sort of collect everybody? It's a good year, it's not an election year, it's coming off
Absolutely.
a four-year term, that you can kind of bring everybody together in this cycle.
The organizational premise is simple. We have to stop pointing fingers, and we have to join hands. And that includes everybody that has a stake in education. You know, everybody, you know, sits around and points to somebody else as being the problem.
Right.
Well, then they're all the problem. And I think that's leadership. If you look back at the Massachusetts example, and I get a little skittish when people say, well, if Massachusetts has done it, we can do it. Well, we're not Massachusetts, we're Rhode Island. That's why there are 50 states in the federal union. But you know, at the same time, we can learn from Massachusetts. And what we can learn is we had a governor, successive governors, both Democrat and Republican. We had speakers of the House, presidents of the Senate, who kind of joined hands and said, we know it's going to be tough, we know there are going to be challenges, but we're going to stay the course. And the problem in this state is not that we don't know what to do, because we do. And there have been studies and there have been initiatives by various commissioners and by various boards of regents and governors. But as soon as the first person protests, we run to the hills and change plans. Great example was we had high stakes testing, and because a parent in a school district felt her child, who may have been disadvantaged some way, could do well in high stakes testing, it became a moral outrage on the third floor of the State House.
Right.
And we changed direction.
One mom and one daughter in Barrington, and
Well, I can guarantee you Massachusetts didn't do it. Massachusetts had slightly better leadership.
what's the pathway? Legislation's going to get introduced. It's going to outline these things. It's going to be with a month left in the session. Not a lot of time to debate these things, perfect these things, analyze these things. It's either going to be mass structure or nothing, I think, in many ways.
Well, no, I guess the Rhode Island equivalent of mass structure. It's unfortunate that there's not been more time to debate it, but it'll need to be implemented, and there'll need to be a leadership commitment to stay the course. But we haven't spoken about funding, and I keep on coming back to funding like a broken record. Unless you adequately and properly fund these things, none of this
But I'm
works.
going to go back to that. If per pupil spending is the same in Rhode Island as it is in Massachusetts, why would we need more money?
Well, you need more money because in urban areas it costs more to educate kids than it does. And I'd like to look at what Massachusetts is spending. Massachusetts, it's interesting. People say Massachusetts came together. Massachusetts came together because 6 weeks before they passed the bill, the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts said, if you don't fix it, we're going to fix it.
Yeah.
And until education becomes a constitutional right, you make progress, and then situations and conditions change, and there's no constitutional reason why you have to stay the course. And that's, people really need to look at the reality of what happened in Massachusetts. The Supreme Judicial Court got everybody's attention. They all got religion.
But we got religion here when those test results came out in late November.
We got attention. Now we're going to find out whether the religion stuck. So we're all in church. We all heard the minister's sermon. Now we're going to go out and have a nice turkey or ham dinner for Sunday dinner. And on Monday, when we go back, are we going to implement the sermon, or are we going to just forget what the minister said?
But I think you've got to give some credit, and I think many people are surprised. Both Speaker Mattiello and Senate President Ruggiero, independent of one another, have consistently raised the issue of the need for substantial school reform after those tests came out. Listen, yes, the teachers' unions are incredibly powerful, but if they want to go home and get reelected, if you're Nick Mattiello in Western Cranston, that's a family district. Those people want good schools. They don't want to find out that Cranston West is worse than Durfee High School in Fall River.
I think everyone's drunk the Kool-Aid. I think everyone recognizes that we have to do something to fix education. I don't for a minute question their motives. I commend their candor in coming out and saying it. And now that we're at the point of having to do something, I kind of look around and say, okay, what do we have to do? Well, I've mentioned the 5 things we have to do. And I see no reason why they won't do those things, but the devil always is in the details.
Right.
So when you do curriculum reform, when you do site-based management, when you do high stakes testing, when you change the school formula, is what you've done actually going to make a difference and change the game? And we'll see the legislation, we'll know.
Who will be the watchdog to those 5 issues up in the General Assembly?
Well, I think the person that needs to be the watchdog, and it's unfortunate, this is one of the weaknesses in our governance system. I am very encouraged by the new superintendent we brought in. I don't know the person, but her background,
You mean commissioner?
New commissioner, yeah,
Of education.
I think her background, her experience is
She's the real deal.
seems to be.
Certainly on paper.
And so was Deborah Gist. And she was. But I think that's encouraging. I think the one thing that we have to strengthen to have the watchdog is our Board of Education and our Council on Post-Secondary Education and Council on Elementary and Secondary.
Do we need to split them back?
Oh, I thought that was the worst mistake in the world when we took them apart, and that was done for some reason that only the Speaker and Hilly O'Mello knew about. None of it, and it was done the last
Wasn't it a
minute.
Senate initiative? Wasn't it?
It was in the House Finance
was it?
Committee, and it was the kind of thing that no one in the business knew about. That just came out at midnight of the budget. That was a mistake. And then they brought a person in who I happened to work with that made some recommendations on how to put it back together without putting it back together to save face. And we've done that. But I'm less concerned, and I think it should be put back together. But I think, and I want to say this, and I'm not critical of anybody. I think people work hard and do a good job. But the people that served on past boards of governors were community leaders. They were heads of big companies. They were heads of big law firms. Bob Flanders, for example, was the chair of the board for Governor Kachiri. I can remember John Kane, who ran Federal Products, was the chairman of the board several years ago.
Sure.
Al Carlotti was chairman of the board of the governors for higher education for a number of years. And all these business guys and business leaders and the poobahs and the wheels and dealers, talk about this and support kind of boutique projects to improve education. Well, the governor has to use her influence to get their name on the line and get them on these governing bodies, because that would be real watchdogs. And you need people who are watching the system, who have some muscle and some gravitas in their own right. And so we brought in a commissioner that we're all encouraged about, and now I think we need to look around. And I'm not worried about the legislation to restructure the board. I'm worried about
More the makeup.
the makeup of the board. The Rhode Island Foundation is doing a good job. There must be people in the Rhode Island Foundation that could serve on these boards. There are business people that preach about the importance of education for their businesses.
Yep.
Well, I know they travel, and I know their businesses are global, but the sense of community needs to be heightened here, and it's those kinds of business and community leaders, church leaders, others, who need to come on these boards. And I would have a lot of confidence in them as watchdogs, because if something wasn't going well,
They'd speak up.
if they walked in the governor, they don't have to speak up publicly. They walked in the governor's office or the speaker's office and said, "This ain't working, Joe."
Yeah.
And they would get attention. And so that's the best kind of watchdog.
Gary Sasse, the money man, thank you so much.
A pleasure.
Wealth of information. Obviously, big focus on the money involved in this.
Small W.
It's all seem to be tied together. The money man, Gary Sasse, Chiching. Thanks everybody for tuning in on Business Monday. We'll be back tomorrow. It is the city's budget introduction. I believe Kate Nagel will be live from City Hall tomorrow. Stay tuned for that, and check out some interesting numbers that are coming out tomorrow in GoLocal on the status of the pensions across the municipalities across the state of Rhode Island. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you back tomorrow.